Good morning. It's Monday, March 10th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 521 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, Syria's new leader is calling for calm after a brutal weekend in his country. More than 1,300 people were reportedly killed in clashes between pro-Assad fighters and regime security forces. The Alawite sect is the group that is being targeted more than any other. And if you ask me, that gives off a distinct whiff of war crimes. Then again, the Alawites may be getting direction from the regime in Tehran, according to some reports that I've seen. Who knows? I'm watching Abu Muhammad al-Jolani carefully because I think his old Nusra Front instincts are not easy to suppress. Remember, this guy used to partner with the Islamic State, and he still counts the terror-supporting regimes of Qatar and Turkey as his patron. Over the weekend, I heard from an interesting source that the HTS regime may try to enable Hamas to move to Syria if the Gaza war begins to wind down. That could be just a rumor, but if it's true, it's a sign that this regime is going to be a haven for the worst actors in the Middle East. We're all watching it play out in real time, folks, and we're going to continue to do that right here, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest today is best-selling author, award-winning columnist, and Emmy-nominated producer Yardena Schwartz. She recently started as executive editor at ARC Media, working with a great friend of the show, Dan Senor, who hosts the Call Me Back podcast. Today, we're going to discuss Yardena's book, Ghosts of a Holy War, which takes a rather fresh look at the Hebron massacre of 1929. Some historians see that terrible incident as the spark that ignited the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as we know it today. Stay tuned for a conversation on Yardena's book, her work combating media bias, and more, coming your way in just a few shakes of a camel's tail. If you're confused about where the war in the Middle East stands right now, you're not alone. The White House is engaging directly with both Iran and Hamas to end this saga. It's entirely unclear what's being achieved. The Iranian regime's octogenarian, psychopathic supreme leader is on social media, excoriating the United States and calling for more Holocaust denial in the American press. Hamas denies all reports of breakthroughs in direct talks with Trump envoy Adam Boehler. Boehler is not making any friends right now. He's publicly called Hamas bad people, but he also bristles at Israeli criticism of the direct talks. Qatar is cut out of the talks, and the regime is grumpy. Qatar is slamming Israel for its undeclared nuclear weapons program while stoking anti-Israel sentiment across the Arab world through state-owned Al Jazeera. These guys hardly look like honest brokers if they ever did so in the first place. Hezbollah's leader, Naim Qassem, went on TV last night and admitted Israel has spanked his terror group like a red-headed stepchild at a family picnic, but he refuses to lay down his arms. The Houthis keep baring their teeth, but they know there will be costs if they launch an attack on American vessels in the Red Sea. Trump will unleash. If you ask me, it all feels like a yellow light at a dangerous intersection. And while the pregnant pause might cause confusion or anxiety, for now, we're no worse off than we were a few months ago when this ceasefire started. Are we better off, though? Who knows? Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Israel will allow Syrian Druze, along with Circassians, another ethnic minority in Syria, to work in the Israeli Golan Heights. Permitting citizens from an adversary state to work in Israel is unusual, to say the least. So what gives? The Syrian Druze, a largely neutral and insular minority wherever they live, have historically maintained semi-positive relations with Israel, particularly with the Israeli Druze community over the years in Israel. So when the Assad regime collapsed in December 2024, the Druze understandably grew a bit uneasy about their al-Qaeda overlords. Following Assad's fall, Israel established a buffer zone in southern Syria, which includes a sizable chunk of the Syrian Druze population. The IDF presence has enabled Israel to strengthen ties with the Druze, permitting them to work in the Golan Heights is a smart move if Israel wants to have allies on the other side of the border. Headline 2, recent meetings in Qatar between top Hamas terrorists and Adam Boehler, the U.S. Presidential Envoy, for hostage affairs are focused on the release of Israeli-American hostage Edan Alexander. It's all a little messy, if you ask me. I certainly want to see Alexander released, but at the same time, America shouldn't be talking to terrorist groups that murder and kidnap, especially terrorist groups on the verge of defeat. This will only serve to bolster the terror group's seriously diminished global standing. That's my view. Some Israelis have voiced their concerns as well, including Israel's Strategic Affairs Minister, Ron Dermer. U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, apparently doesn't agree. He's set to travel to Qatar this week to join the discussions on hostage releases and a potential ceasefire extension. All eyes on that American hostage, though. Edan Alexander is a 21-year-old New Jersey native. He served as a lone soldier in the IDF's Golani Brigade before he was abducted on October 7th from an IDF guard post in southern Israel. He's believed to be the last remaining living American hostage in Gaza. You may recall a chilling Hamas propaganda video released months ago in which he appears gaunt and sobbing. Released hostages who were held with him have described the horrific conditions he has endured: torture, starvation, intense interrogation. He's been shackled in tunnels for most of his captivity. Headline 3, the Trump administration has followed through on its threat to cancel federal funding to Columbia University, revoking $400 million due to the institution's failure to respond to campus anti-Semitism. We've all watched in horror. Anti-Semitism at Columbia has extended beyond a few disruptive students. The university's pro-Hamas protests have affected both Jewish and non-Jewish faculty and students. Sadly, there have been few consequences, if any, for those engaged in hate speech, intimidation, destruction of property, and other obvious criminal acts. And now get this. The funding cuts coincide with Saturday night's arrest of Mahmoud Khalil by federal immigration authorities. Khalil, a key figure in the university's anti-Israel encampment movement, may actually lose his green card because of his role in fostering anti-Semitism on campus. I'm sure everyone's lawyering up for that one, and nobody knows how it's going to play out. But I think it's safe to say that a serious and unequivocal message has now been sent. I'm certain other schools and other anti-Semites are watching. All right, it's time for my live conversation with Yardena Schwartz. We're going to discuss her book about the 1929 Hebron massacre, Ghosts of a Holy War, and how that event changed the trajectory of the Middle East. But Yardena has lots to say on other topics too. Let's do it. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Yardena Schwartz.
Great to be here, Jonathan. Thank you.
All right, well, first, let's just set a level here. What happened in 1929 in Hebron, and why did you decide writing about the book 90 years later?
Well, in 1929, there was a massacre of Jews living in Hebron by their Arab neighbors, in which 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered in atrocities that were hauntingly similar to what befell Israelis in southern Israel on October 7th. But I actually began writing this book 4 years before October 7th, and I never imagined how relevant this massacre would become to understanding how we got to this point in history. So I actually started writing this book not because I decided to write a book about the massacre, but because I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, with a very strong connection to this massacre through their great uncle who was murdered in the massacre.
So yeah, you've got really interesting primary sources in your book, front-loaded, I guess, for the first 100 pages or so. Specifically, I'm talking about the letters of David Schoenberg, and he was ultimately one of the Jewish victims killed by that mob in Hebron in 29. How did you come to learn of their existence? I mean, how did this all play out? And what was it like just reading through those letters?
So they discovered these letters back in 2009 in their attic, and it was just in this mysterious box that they didn't know existed. They just found it when they were moving to a new home, and the box was filled with hundreds of pages of letters written by David in the year that he was living in Hebron, studying at what was then the most prestigious yeshiva in the land of Israel. And over the course of that year that he was studying there, he sent his family these vivid, beautifully written letters describing what life was like in Hebron before the massacre. And what fascinated me about the letters, I mean, one of many things that fascinated me about them was that this place that we know today as kind of the epicenter of this conflict was once a beacon of coexistence, where Jews and Muslims had lived in relative peace, side by side, for generations, owned businesses together. Many of the Jews living in Hebron then rented their homes from Arab landlords. And, his letters just really painted this vivid portrait of a place and a time that has ceased to exist, and a time of coexistence that really was shattered as a direct result of that massacre that took his life at such a young age. He was just 23 at the time. And this family had been kind of just sitting on these letters. They archived them, and they decided that they were sitting on this treasure trove of history, and they wanted somebody to tell this story. And I was actually introduced to them by Yossi Klein Halevi, who became my mentor in writing this book. And I can't thank Yossi enough for his guidance over the course of this entire journey.
Yeah, Yossi's a great guy, a great writer. You tracked down some of the families of the Arabs who helped protect the Jews back during that horrible episode. Tell us about that.
So in 1929, while 67 men, women, and children were slaughtered, at least 200 others were actually rescued by their courageous Muslim neighbors who risked their own lives to either hide their Jewish neighbors in their homes or stand guard outside of their homes, and telling the mob that, if they wanted to get into these homes and kill the Jews inside, they would have to first get through them. So we really saw just heroes in 1929, similar to what we saw from many Muslim citizens of Israel on October 7th, who rescued hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish Israelis from the terrorists in southern Israel on October 7th. Sadly, it was really difficult to find descendants of those courageous Muslims from 1929. Just one of them, who lives in Hebron today, was willing to speak with me on the record for this book. I had found another one in Jerusalem, but sadly those who are in Hebron, still living in Hebron, would not speak with me, either because they are ashamed of their own ancestors, or because they know that the way their ancestors would be seen today would not be as heroes, but as traitors or so-called collaborators, as peace-seeking Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza are often referred to now. And that is much a result of the leadership of the Palestinian Muslims in 1929, who kind of set that formula of labeling those who want to cooperate and live in peace as collaborators. And the pattern of assassinations of those people began actually after 1929 as a result of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini's kind of hijacking of the Arab population in Palestine at the time.
Yeah, your book, you talk about the letters that some of these, we'll call them righteous Muslims, that they actually still have. They maintain these documents from, 90 years ago. Pretty remarkable. You actually also talked quite a bit about Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti, and his connections to Nazis and worse. But let me ask you, just fast forwarding back to today, you engaged with Israeli settlers in Hebron while you were writing this book. And I think you gave voice to some of their frustrations with the Israeli government, which has limited their ability to expand the Jewish presence in Hebron. So talk to us about that. I think you really did kind of thread a needle here, bouncing back and forth between these communities.
Right. So over the course of my research for this book, I spent hundreds of hours with both Palestinians in Hebron and Israelis in Hebron. And I think that they're coming to this book, I kind of had the impression that all settlers in Hebron are these extremists, these radical fundamentalists, violent people. And I was struck by how many of them were nothing close to what I had expected going into these interviews. Many of them, are not happy with, some of the violence that they're seeing in the West Bank and in Hebron. And what they believe is that, we wouldn't be seeing this violence and as well as the restrictive measures against Palestinians if, terrorist acts weren't a daily fact of life in in Hebron or other parts of the West Bank. They're also very frustrated with the Israeli government for the fact that, 95 years after this massacre that decimated this most ancient of Jewish communities, the size of the Jewish community in Hebron is still just 800 people like it was in 1929. And it's not for lack of people wanting to live there. It's the fact that it's almost illegal to live in Hebron in a way. At least that's how the Israeli government kind of treats it, despite the fact that there is a right-wing government. They say that, they can't get permits to build new homes or to even live in abandoned homes, Jewish homes that were abandoned in 1929 and then occupied by the Jordanians. So they are frustrated that, despite many different governments kind of support, and that support has not just come from right-wing governments, by the way. I mean, Yair Lapid has expressed support for the Jewish community in Hebron. Ben-Gurion himself was one of the biggest supporters of the return of the Jewish community to Hebron after 1967. And yet it's still almost impossible to bring in Jews who want to live in Hebron because of the lack of space there. It's also illegal for Palestinians to sell their homes. It's illegal under the Palestinian Authority for Arabs to sell homes to Jews. So in cases where they have managed to buy property from Arab residents who are no longer living there, Arab landowners, those cases are then kind of tried in court or denied by the sellers that they sold them. So it's just a very complicated dynamic there.
Yeah, complicated to say the least. And the times that I've been to Hebron over the years, the tension is palpable. The security is usually insane. The army presence is massive. Probably there's no place that you see more of that than the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. Tell us just a little bit about that and why that is such a central component of the conflict.
Well, in 1929, Jews were forbidden from entering the Tomb of the Patriarchs. Actually, for 700 years under Muslim rule, only Muslims were permitted to enter the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs, home of, the burial place of the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people. After 1967, when Israel conquered it, there were, today people of any religion can enter. There's, a Muslim side of the tomb, which is considered a mosque, and a Jewish side. Most of the time inside, it's very peaceful, but outside, security is very, very intense. Actually, the first time that I went to report in Hebron for my book, there had been an attempted stabbing by a female terrorist against soldiers guarding the tomb that morning. And there have been many terrorist attacks against the soldiers guarding the tomb, both, for the purpose of, not just Israelis who want to visit the tomb, but many tourists come to that tomb. It's one of the biggest tourist draws in Israel. As it's a holy place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. So today it's kind of a center point of the conflict because I think it symbolizes what has always been a holy war. I mean, this began in 1929 with rumors spread by the Grand Mufti that Jews were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Those rumors continue today as a result of Hamas propaganda and others. But in Hebron in 1929, that rumor also extended to the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. And one of the reasons that slaughter was enabled in 1929, despite the amazing relations between Arabs and Jews, was because there had been a rumor also that Jews in Hebron planned to conquer Ibrahimi Mosque, which is the Arabic name for the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. So, the disinformation and weaponization of Islam has really driven this conflict for the last century.
It has. Well, I think let's just acknowledge your book came out at the right time or maybe the wrong time, depending on how you view it. There are obviously parallels between the 1929 slaughter of Jews and the 2023 Hamas slaughter of Jews. What are the lessons that you take away when you start to compare?
Well, the parallels are really just haunting and make you wonder how 1 century later we are still we still haven't figured out how to counter the disinformation, propaganda, and weaponization of Islam that has fueled this conflict since 1929. I mean, the atrocities committed on October 7th were almost exactly the same as those committed in 1929. And, you know, in 1929, there was no occupation, there were no Israeli soldiers, there was no state of Israel. I mean, Jews were a weak minority in the British Mandate of Palestine, just 20% of a population of less than 1 million people. And yet, you know, the disinformation regarding this supposed Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa managed to convince Muslims, not just in Hebron, but throughout Palestine, to slaughter their Jewish neighbors. And so I think the lesson here is that we cannot take for granted the strength and the power to galvanize that Al-Aqsa plays, that disinformation plays. And I think that so many more resources, not only in Israel, but throughout the world, need to be put into combating that disinformation and weakening the forces that are perpetuating that disinformation. I mean, much of it is coming from imams, not only in the West Bank and Jerusalem, but around the world. And we're seeing how quickly that disinformation has seeped into American society as well.
Yeah, it's global. Before we let you go, just curious, what else are you working on these days?
Well, I'm very busy with my new job now as executive editor of ARC Media, working with Dan Sinor and his amazing team, and I'm really excited about that. And, you know, still doing my book tour, speaking across the country about the book and the lessons it holds, and holding book signings. So, and I have 2 little kids, a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, so that keeps me very busy as well.
Yeah, sounds busy. All right, well, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Yardena Schwartz, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It was great to be here.
All right, highly recommend that book, folks. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Mark Montgomery has teamed up with 2 scholars from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington here to try to answer one question, and it's an important one as Donald Trump tries to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, namely, how many aircraft are required to secure Ukrainian airspace sufficiently to deter Russian provocation during negotiations? It's a smart piece, worth reading, complete with a map and everything. Go check that one out on FDD's website. Check out the second edition of FDD's Trump Administration Foreign Policy Tracker, where our team of experts and scholars offer comprehensive assessments of the administration's foreign policy, providing trend lines that range from very positive to neutral to negative to very negative. Our people call them as they see them, so take a look on our website and keep coming back for our updated nonpartisan analyses each and every month. Finally, if you haven't had enough of me today, my colleague Ahmed Sharawi and I published an article in the National Interest on Friday examining Oman's support for the Yemen-based Houthi terrorists. Like Qatar, Oman enjoys strategic relations with the United States while simultaneously harboring members of U.S.-designated terrorist organizations. Ahmed and I don't mince words. The White House needs to pressure Muscat to shutter the Houthi headquarters within its borders and to expel Houthi leaders living there. Should Oman refuse to take these actions, Washington has to consider sanctions or even tougher measures. After all, with friends like these, who needs enemies? And that's going to do it for today, folks. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels to boot. And please join the special community of those who support our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. We are truly grateful to our donors for helping make this work possible. We literally cannot do it without you. Tune in Wednesday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief featuring Leanne Pollock-David, former advisor at the Israeli Prime Minister's Office and the National Security Council, former member of the negotiation team with the Palestinians, and a founding partner of the newly established Coalition for Regional Security. Should be a good one, so do tune in. Until then, have a great start to your week. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.